The carving knife froze mid-slice as my Uncle Derek pointed toward the front door. "Sarah, you need to leave, now." The words cut through the warm kitchen air thick with turkey and tension. 23 family members sat around my grandmother's mahogany dining table, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and relief. For the third year running, I was being asked to leave Thanksgiving dinner. They said I was a reminder of everything wrong with our family's name. But then the doorbell rang, and everything changed. A man in a crisp blue uniform stood on the porch, his chest heavy with medals I recognized from a distance. When he saw me through the window, he snapped to attention and spoke words that shattered my family's perfect lie. "Captain Martinez, it's an honor to meet you. I'm Colonel James Patterson, pilot of Air Force One. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My name is Sarah Elena Martinez, and for the past 8 years, I've been the family ghost at every holiday gathering. To them, I'm the daughter who threw away a full scholarship to Stanford, who disappeared for years without explanation, who came back with nothing to show for my absence except a beat-up Honda Civic and an apartment above a laundromat in Phoenix. They don't know the truth because I've been legally forbidden to tell them. The morning of that fateful Thanksgiving started like every other holiday in recent years. I sat in my cramped studio apartment, staring at the formal invitation my mother had sent. It wasn't warm or welcoming. The cream-colored cardstock with its elegant script felt more like a court summons than a family gathering invite. Annual Martinez Family Thanksgiving. Your attendance is expected for appearances. Arrival time, 2 p.m. sharp. Please dress appropriately and keep conversations brief. There was no "Love, Mom," or "Can't wait to see you," just cold, clinical instructions. I pulled on a simple navy blazer and black slacks, the closest thing to formal wear in my sparse wardrobe. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 32 years. The Arizona sun had weathered my face, and my once-long hair was now cropped short in a practical style that wouldn't interfere with wearing headgear. I looked nothing like the promising young woman who had left for college 14 years ago, with dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon. The drive to my childhood home in Scottsdale took me through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent. My Honda coughed and wheezed as it climbed the hills toward the gated community where I'd grown up. The contrast was stark and intentional. I passed gleaming Mercedes sedans and BMW SUVs, their pristine paint jobs reflecting the desert sun. My car, with its faded blue paint and a rear bumper held on with duct tape, looked like it belonged in a different world entirely. The Martinez family compound sat on 3 acres of meticulously manicured desert landscape. Palm trees lined the circular driveway, and a fountain featuring dancing dolphins sent crystalline water arcing through the air. This was old money, generational wealth, built on my great-grandfather's cattle ranching empire that had evolved into commercial real estate development. Every blade of grass was perfect, every shrub trimmed to mathematical precision. It was a showpiece designed to intimidate, and it still worked on me after all these years. I parked behind the garage, in the spot traditionally reserved for service vehicles. It was where I'd been told to park since my return, a not-so-subtle reminder of my status in the family hierarchy. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother, Isabella Martinez, directing the hired catering staff with military precision. She wore a cream-colored St. John suit that probably cost more than my annual rent. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her jewelry caught the light as she gestured. She was still beautiful at 58, with the kind of timeless elegance that came from never having to worry about money. My father, Roberto Martinez, held court in the living room with my uncles and male cousins. He was a commanding presence at 6'2", his silver hair perfectly styled, and his custom-tailored suit emphasizing his still athletic build. At 61, he remained the undisputed patriarch of the Martinez clan, a man whose word was law and whose approval was the currency that determined your worth in this family. The formal dining room buzzed with conversation as relatives caught up on the year's accomplishments. My cousin Michael was regaling everyone with stories of his latest promotion to senior partner at his law firm. My sister Carmen showed off photos from her recent vacation to the French Riviera with her investment banker husband. Uncle Derek discussed his son's acceptance to Harvard Medical School. Every conversation was a performance, a carefully choreographed display of success and status. I entered through the back door, as had become my custom. The kitchen staff nodded politely but said nothing. They knew my story, or at least the version my family had carefully crafted. I was the disappointment, the black sheep who had squandered every opportunity handed to her. I made my way to the dining room and took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, next to my grandmother's empty chair. Even though she'd passed away 2 years ago, her chair remained, and I sat in her shadow. The dinner conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed stock portfolios and real estate investments, charity galas, and country club politics. I might as well have been invisible. When anyone did acknowledge my presence, it was with thinly veiled disdain or uncomfortable silence. My Aunt Patricia mentioned her daughter's upcoming wedding, making sure to note that it would be a small, intimate affair for close family only. The message was clear. Then my cousin Jessica, fresh out of business school, decided to twist the knife a little deeper. "Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what exactly is it that you do again? I mean, for work?" The table fell silent. Every eye turned to me, waiting for my response. I'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but it never got easier. "I work in transportation logistics," I said simply. It wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth. The table erupted in barely contained snickers. Transportation logistics to them meant driving trucks or working in a warehouse. It was blue-collar work, beneath the Martinez family standards. That's when Uncle Derek decided he'd had enough of my presence contaminating their perfect family gathering. He stood up, his face red with wine and indignation. "This is ridiculous," he announced to the room. "Every year we pretend this is normal, having her here like some kind of charity case. She's an embarrassment to everything this family stands for." My mother didn't defend me. My father continued cutting his turkey, as if nothing was happening. My sister Carmen studied her manicured nails with intense fascination. The silence from my family was more devastating than Derek's words. "Sarah," Derek continued, pointing toward the front door, "you need to leave. Now, this is a family dinner for people who've actually made something of their lives." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual delivery. 23 family members sat around that table, and not one of them spoke up for me. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I was gathering what remained of my dignity when fate intervened in the form of a doorbell that would change everything. The deep, resonant chime of the front doorbell cut through the tension like a blade. My mother frowned, checking her watch. "We're not expecting anyone," she said, her voice tight with annoyance at the interruption to Derek's dramatic dismissal of me. Through the front window, I could see a figure in military dress blues standing on the porch. Even from a distance, the uniform was unmistakable. The distinctive blue fabric, the precise creases, the rows of ribbons and medals that caught the afternoon light. My heart began to race, but I kept my expression neutral. After 8 years of practice, I'd become an expert at hiding my emotions. My father moved to answer the door, his businessman's smile already in place. He was probably expecting some kind of ceremonial visit, perhaps someone delivering a commendation to the wrong address. The Martinez family had no military connections, at least none that they acknowledged publicly. The man at the door was tall and distinguished, probably in his early 50s, with graying temples and the ramrod straight posture that marked career military officers. His uniform was immaculate, every button gleaming, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. But it was the wings on his chest that made my breath catch, the distinctive pilot's wings that I recognized immediately. My father opened the door with his practiced charm. "Good afternoon, officer. I think you might have the wrong address." The officer's eyes swept past my father, scanning the room beyond until they found me standing by the dining table. When our eyes met, something extraordinary happened. His military bearing, already impressive, seemed to intensify. His back straightened even further, and his expression shifted from polite professionalism to something approaching reverence. "No, sir," he said to my father, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I have exactly the right address. I'm looking for Captain Sarah Martinez." The effect of his words was immediate and electric. Every conversation in the dining room stopped mid-sentence. Derek's finger, still pointing toward the door, slowly lowered. My mother's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Carmen looked up from her nails with confusion written across her face. The name Captain Martinez hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Colonel Patterson, for that's who he was, though I didn't know it yet, stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation. His eyes never left mine as he crossed the room with purposeful strides. The family parted before him like the Red Sea, too stunned to do anything but stare. When he reached me, he came to attention with the kind of precision that spoke of decades of military discipline. His salute was perfect, textbook form that would have made any drill instructor proud. And then he spoke the words that detonated my family's carefully constructed lie. Captain Martinez, it's an honor to meet you. I'm Colonel James Patterson, pilot of Air Force One. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 23 pairs of eyes stared at me in shock, confusion, and dawning realization. The family disappointment, the transportation logistics worker, the embarrassment they'd been trying to exile from their perfect dinner, had just been addressed as Captain by the man who flew the President of the United States. In that moment, the foundation of everything they thought they knew about me began to crack, and I was the earthquake that was about to bring their house of lies crashing down. The weight of Colonel Patterson's words settled over the dining room like desert dust after a sandstorm. I watched my family's faces transform from confusion to disbelief to something approaching terror. My father's businessman smile had completely vanished, replaced by the pale complexion of a man who had just realized he'd been living a lie for 8 years. There must be some mistake, my mother stammered, her perfectly composed facade cracking like expensive porcelain. Sarah works in transportation. She drives trucks or something. Her voice trailed off as she noticed Colonel Patterson's expression shift from respectful attention to barely contained incredulity. Colonel Patterson turned to face my mother, his military bearing radiating authority that filled the room. Ma'am, with all due respect, Captain Martinez doesn't drive trucks. She flies C-17 Globemasters and has logged over 3,000 hours, piloting some of the most critical missions in United States Air Force history. He paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the knockout blow. Yesterday, she completed her final training certification to serve as backup pilot for Air Force One. The crystal wine glass slipped from Carmen's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of red wine and glittering fragments. Uncle Derek dropped heavily into his chair, his face the color of ash. The same man who had been pointing toward the door minutes earlier now looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. That's impossible, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. We would have known. Sarah never mentioned any of this. His eyes searched my face desperately, looking for some sign that this was all an elaborate hoax. Colonel Patterson's expression hardened. Sir, Captain Martinez's assignments have been classified at the highest levels. Her work has taken her to places and situations that most Americans will never know existed. The fact that she couldn't share details of her service with her family doesn't diminish her sacrifice. It magnifies it. I had remained silent through this entire exchange, watching my family's world implode with the detached fascination of someone who had waited 8 long years for this moment. But now Colonel Patterson turned back to me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't experienced in nearly a decade. Respect, pride, recognition. Captain, I apologize for interrupting your family gathering, but I wanted to personally deliver your final certification documents. He reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio. Effective Monday, you'll be qualified to serve as pilot or co-pilot for any aircraft in the presidential fleet, including Air Force One itself. He handed me the portfolio, and as I accepted it, he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. I've reviewed your service record, Captain. Kandahar, Ramstein, that emergency medical evacuation over the Pacific when you flew for 18 straight hours through a typhoon to save those Marines. You're exactly the kind of pilot we want, protecting our commander-in-chief. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as I opened the portfolio. Inside were official documents bearing the presidential seal, my new security clearances, and a letter of commendation signed by the Secretary of Defense himself. The papers felt surreal in my hands, tangible proof of a life my family had never imagined I was living. My cousin Michael, the hotshot lawyer who had been boasting about his partnership earlier, found his voice first. "Sarah, is this real? Are you actually in the Air Force?" His question came out as barely more than a whisper. I looked around the table at their faces, seeing a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension. These people who had spent years treating me like a failure, who had just tried to exile me from their Thanksgiving dinner, were finally seeing me clearly for the first time in 8 years. I said simply. "I'm a captain in the United States Air Force, and I've been serving my country while you all assumed I was wasting my life." The silence stretched until Colonel Patterson broke it with military efficiency. "Captain, your country owes you a debt of gratitude that extends far beyond today's recognition. The missions you've flown, the lives you've saved, the sacrifices you've made, they matter more than you know." After Colonel Patterson left, the dining room felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster. The perfectly set table remained untouched, the turkey growing cold while my family struggled to process what they had just witnessed. I remained standing where the colonel had found me, the leather portfolio still clutched in my hands like armor against their stares. My father was the first to attempt recovery. His business instincts kicked in, that automatic reflex to control the narrative and minimize damage. "Sarah, why didn't you tell us? We had no idea you were serving our country. We're proud of you, of course, but why all the secrecy?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications he didn't even realize he was making. Why the secrecy? Because when I had tried to tell them about my acceptance to the Air Force Academy 13 years ago, they had refused to listen. Because when I had come home after my first deployment, they had lectured me about wasting my Stanford scholarship. Because every time I had attempted to share even the smallest details of my service, they had dismissed it as a phase 1 needed to outgrow. "You never wanted to hear it," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. "When I graduated from the academy, you were embarrassed that I chose military service over medical school. When I earned my pilot wings, you told your friends I was still finding myself. When I came home after my first combat deployment, you asked when I was going to get a real job." Carmen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her designer dress suddenly feeling too tight. "We didn't understand," she said weakly. "You never explained properly." "I tried," I replied, the weight of 8 years of frustration finally finding its voice. "I tried to tell you about flight school, about the academy, about what my service meant to me. But every conversation ended with you asking when I was going to settle down, get married, and pursue something more appropriate for a Martinez woman." The truth of it settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. They hadn't just failed to ask about my life, they had actively discouraged me from sharing it. They had created the very silence they now claimed had kept them in the dark. Uncle Derek, who had been demanding my removal from the dinner just minutes earlier, now looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Sarah, I had no idea. If we had known you were serving your country—" "You would have what?" I interrupted. "Been proud, supported me, asked about my experiences." I shook my head. "Derek, you just tried to throw me out of Thanksgiving dinner because you thought I was an embarrassment to the family name. Finding out I'm a military officer doesn't change who I am. It just changes your perception of my value." My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window overlooking the perfectly manicured backyard where we had played as children. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotions I had never heard from her before. "I remember when you were little. You used to lie on the grass and watch planes fly overhead. You would tell me you were going to be a pilot someday, and I would smile and change the subject." She turned back to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I was protecting you from unrealistic dreams. I thought I was guiding you toward a more suitable path." The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. For the first time in years, my mother looked fragile, human, fallible. The perfect socialite facade had cracked, revealing the woman underneath who had spent 8 years wondering where her daughter had gone. "I've been flying cargo planes into war zones," I said quietly. "I've evacuated wounded soldiers from battlefields. delivered humanitarian aid to disaster areas, and transported government officials to classified locations around the world. Last month, I flew a mission that I can't even tell you about, to a place that doesn't officially exist, carrying passengers whose names will never appear in any newspaper. The weight of those words seemed to press down on everyone in the room. This wasn't just about missed family dinners or awkward holiday conversations anymore. This was about a daughter who had been living an entirely different life, bearing responsibilities and carrying burdens that her family couldn't even begin to comprehend. My father sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 61 years. "Sarah, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix this." "You can't fix it," I said, "but not with cruelty." It was simply the truth. 8 years of service, of classified missions, of being legally unable to share the most important parts of my life with my own family. You can't fix that with an apology or by suddenly deciding I'm worth your respect now that you know what I do for a living. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, marking another hour in a day that had already changed everything. I looked around the dining room one more time, taking in the faces of people who shared my blood but had never really known me. Tomorrow, I would report for duty at Andrews Air Force Base. Next week, I might be flying the President of the United States to a summit that could change the course of history. But tonight, I was still just Sarah Martinez, standing in her childhood home, finally free to tell the truth. "I need to go," I said, tucking the leather portfolio under my arm. "I have an early flight tomorrow." This time, no one tried to stop me. The drive back to my Phoenix apartment felt different this time. The desert highway stretched ahead of me, illuminated by the setting sun that painted the mountains in shades of copper and gold. My Honda's engine hummed steadily, no longer the embarrassing contrast to luxury vehicles it had seemed just hours earlier. Now it was simply transportation, carrying a woman who had finally reclaimed her story. The leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat beside me, its weight both literal and symbolic. Inside those documents was validation of 8 years of service, sacrifice, and silence. But more than that, they represented a future I had earned through countless hours of training, through missions that had tested every limit of my skill and courage, through nights when I had fallen asleep in foreign countries wondering if my family even remembered I existed. My phone buzzed with text messages as I pulled into my apartment complex. The first was from Carmen, sent just 20 minutes after I had left the house. "Sarah, please call me. We need to talk. I'm so sorry." The second came from my cousin Michael. "I can't believe we didn't know. I feel like an idiot. Can we meet for coffee this week?" Even Uncle Derek had sent a message, though his was characteristically brief. "Spoke out of turn today. My apologies." I turned off the phone without responding to any of them. Their sudden interest in reconciliation felt hollow, motivated more by social embarrassment than genuine remorse. They hadn't reached out because they had discovered something new about my character or worth. They had reached out because a man in uniform had forced them to confront their own assumptions and prejudices. My apartment was exactly as I had left it that morning. Small, sparsely furnished, but meticulously clean and organized. The military had taught me to find comfort in simplicity, to measure wealth not in possessions but in purpose. The framed photograph on my nightstand showed my graduating class from the Air Force Academy, 37 young men and women who had sworn an oath to defend their country. I was in the back row, my face serious and determined, already looking toward a future my family would never understand. That evening, I sat on my small balcony overlooking the Phoenix skyline, drinking coffee from a chipped mug that had traveled with me through 3 different military assignments. The city lights twinkled below like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the distant rumble of aircraft taking off from Sky Harbor Airport. Each plane carried its own cargo of dreams, destinations, and purposes, just as I had carried mine through 8 years of service my family had dismissed as failure. The next morning brought a knock on my door that I wasn't expecting. Through the peephole, I saw my father standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the modest apartment complex. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He wore khakis and a polo shirt instead of his usual business attire, and his silver hair was slightly mussed, as if he had been running his hands through it during the drive. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. We stood there facing each other across the threshold, two people who shared DNA but had become strangers through years of mutual disappointment and misunderstanding. "I've been thinking all night," he said without preamble, "about what you said yesterday, about how we never listened. You're right, Sarah. We failed you in ways I'm only beginning to understand." His admission was unexpected, delivered without the practiced polish of his usual speeches. This wasn't Roberto Martinez, the businessman or patriarch. This was simply a father who had spent the night confronting his own failures. "I brought something," he continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by age and handling. "This belonged to my father, your grandfather Eduardo. He served in World War II, flew bomber missions over Europe. I never told you about his service because your grandmother asked me not to. She said the war had taken enough from their family already." He opened the box to reveal a set of pilot's wings, tarnished with age but still recognizable. Beside them lay a small black and white photograph of a young man in military dress, his face serious beneath his pilot's cap. "He would have been proud of you," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "He would have understood your choice in ways I never could. I spent so many years trying to distance our family from military service because I thought it represented limitation, sacrifice without reward. I was wrong." The wings felt heavy in my palm, cool metal that connected me to a grandfather I had barely known but who had apparently shared my dreams of flight. The photograph showed a man who couldn't have been much older than I was now, facing his own uncertain future with the same determination I had carried through my own service. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because yesterday I watched a stranger show my daughter more respect and recognition than her own father had given her in 8 years. Because I realized that while I was building a business empire and accumulating wealth, you were serving something greater than yourself. Because I want to know who you really are, not who I expected you to be." Over the following weeks, the tentative rebuilding began. My mother called every few days, awkward conversations that gradually evolved from stilted apologies to genuine curiosity about my experiences. She asked about flight training, about the places I had been, about the weight of responsibility I carried. For the first time in years, she listened more than she spoke. Carmen visited my apartment, bringing takeout Chinese food and a willingness to sit on my small couch and hear stories I had never been able to tell. I found myself describing the rush of takeoff in a fully loaded cargo plane, the precision required for in-flight refueling, the quiet satisfaction of landing safely after a difficult mission. She listened with the fascination of someone discovering that her sister was a completely different person than she had imagined. The most surprising change came from Uncle Derek. He appeared at my door 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, carrying a stack of books about military aviation and a sheepish expression. "I've been reading," he said simply, "trying to understand what you do, what you've accomplished. I wanted to know enough to ask intelligent questions." We spent 2 hours on my balcony as he asked about aircraft specifications, flight procedures, and mission planning. His questions were thoughtful and informed, revealing genuine effort to bridge the gap between his world and mine. When he left, he shook my hand with the same formality he might show a respected colleague. The real test came during my first assignment as backup pilot for Air Force One. The mission was a presidential visit to a NATO summit in Brussels, a routine diplomatic flight that nonetheless carried the weight of representing American air power on the world stage. I sat in the right seat of the massive Boeing VC-25, watching the countryside of 3 countries pass beneath us, while the president conducted meetings in the forward cabin. During our fuel stop in Shannon, Ireland, my phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Saw the news coverage of the president's trip. Are you flying that plane?" For the first time in 8 years, her question carried pride instead of embarrassment. I typed back a simple response. "Can't confirm specific assignments, but I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Her reply came immediately. "I'm telling everyone." The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. There were still awkward moments, still conversations that revealed the depth of the chasm that had opened between us. But there was also something new, a foundation of respect that hadn't existed before Colonel Patterson had walked into that dining room and forced my family to see me clearly. 6 months later, I received orders for a new assignment, promotion to major, and a position at the Pentagon working on strategic airlift operations. The night before I left Phoenix, my entire family gathered at my parents' house for dinner. Not a formal holiday obligation, but a genuine celebration of my achievement. This time, I sat at the head of the table, in the spot traditionally reserved for the guest of honor. My father raised his wineglass for a toast, his voice steady and proud. To Major Sarah Martinez, who chose to serve something greater than herself, and who taught her family the true meaning of honor. As I looked around the table at their faces, I realized that the 8 years of silence hadn't been wasted. They had taught me to find strength in isolation, to measure my worth by my own standards rather than others' expectations, to serve with dedication even when that service went unrecognized. Most importantly, they had taught me that respect earned through sacrifice and dedication was worth more than approval given freely. The girl who had once lain on the grass watching planes fly overhead had become the woman piloting those planes. The daughter, who had been dismissed as a failure, had become the major trusted with the nation's most critical aviation missions. And the family that had once tried to exile me from their dinner table now understood that some stories are worth waiting years to hear. My journey had come full circle, but I was no longer the same person who had started it. I was stronger, more confident, and finally free to be exactly who I was meant to be. The silence was over, and my story had finally found its voice. 3 years into my Pentagon assignment, I thought I had finally found equilibrium. The early morning runs through Arlington National Cemetery had become my meditation, weaving between rows of white headstones that reminded me why my service mattered. My corner office overlooked the Potomac River, and my days were filled with strategic planning sessions that shaped military aviation policy across multiple theaters of operation. But equilibrium, I had learned, was often just the calm before the next storm. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing deployment schedules for humanitarian missions in Southeast Asia. My assistant's voice carried an unusual tension through the intercom. Major Martinez, you have a priority call from General Patricia Hawkins' office. She needs to see you immediately. General Hawkins commanded the Air Mobility Command, overseeing every cargo plane, tanker aircraft, and passenger transport in the Air Force. She was a legend, a woman who had shattered every glass ceiling in military aviation and paved the way for officers like me. A summons to her office could mean promotion, assignment to a classified program, or career-ending trouble. In the military, you never knew which until you walked through the door. Her office occupied prime real estate on the Pentagon's E-ring, with windows facing the Washington Monument. The walls displayed photographs of her with presidents, prime ministers, and military leaders from around the world. Behind her desk hung a painting of the Berlin airlift, one of the greatest humanitarian missions in military history. General Hawkins stood when I entered, returning my salute with the crisp precision that had defined her 30-year career. She was smaller than her reputation suggested, barely 5'4", but her presence filled the room like concentrated authority. Major Martinez, sit down. We need to discuss your next assignment. Her tone was neutral, giving nothing away. I've been following your work on strategic airlift optimization. Your recommendations for cargo distribution efficiency have saved the Air Force millions of dollars and countless operational hours. I remained at attention, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Compliments from general officers were rarely delivered without purpose. However, she continued, your expertise is needed elsewhere. There's a situation developing that requires someone with your specific skill set and security clearance level. She turned to face the window, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture I recognized from my own command training. When leaders needed to deliver difficult news, they often looked away to gather their thoughts and steel their resolve. 6 months ago, intelligence agencies identified a network of arms dealers operating out of Eastern Europe. They're smuggling advanced weapons systems to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Traditional military operations would cause too much diplomatic fallout, but we need someone on the inside to gather intelligence and identify their supply chains. My stomach tightened. This sounded like a special operations assignment, the kind of mission that existed in shadows and never appeared in official records. You're suggesting an undercover operation, I said carefully. I'm offering you a chance to use your aviation expertise in ways that could prevent those weapons from reaching targets on American soil, General Hawkins replied, turning back to face me. The cover story is perfect. You would resign your commission, publicly citing disagreements with military policy. Your family's wealth and social connections would provide credibility as a civilian contractor, looking to profit from gray market aircraft sales. The irony was breathtaking. After years of my family seeing my military service as an embarrassment, I was being asked to make their disapproval real. I would have to publicly disgrace myself, abandon the career I had fought to build, and convince the world that Major Sarah Martinez had become exactly the kind of person her family had always feared she might become. This mission could last 18 months to 3 years, General Hawkins continued. During that time, you would have no contact with military personnel, no backup from official channels, and no acknowledgement from the United States government if anything went wrong. You would truly be on your own. The weight of what she was asking settled over me like lead blankets. Not only would I be walking away from everything I had built, but I would be destroying my family's newfound respect and pride in my service. The relationships we had spent years rebuilding would crumble under the weight of my apparent betrayal of everything they had learned to admire about my career. Why me? I asked. Because you've already proven you can survive being disowned by the people who matter most to you. Because you've demonstrated the ability to maintain your integrity even when everyone around you questions your choices. Because you're one of the few officers I trust to come back from the darkness without losing yourself in it. Her assessment was clinical but accurate. The 8 years of family exile had been unintentional preparation for a mission that would require me to accept the hatred and disappointment of everyone I cared about. I had already lived through being seen as a failure and disappointment. I could survive it again if necessary. What's the timeline for a decision? I asked. 72 hours. If you accept, your resignation will be processed immediately, and your transformation into Sarah Martinez, disgraced former military officer turned mercenary pilot, will begin next week. I spent those 3 days walking through Washington, visiting the monuments and memorials that represented the ideals I had sworn to defend. The Lincoln Memorial, with its inscription about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where I traced names of pilots who had given everything for their country. The World War II Memorial, where my grandfather's generation had proven that freedom was worth any sacrifice. On the third evening, I called my father from the steps of the Jefferson Memorial. The conversation was brief and painful. Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to trust me even when you don't understand. Sarah, what's wrong? You sound different. I'm resigning my commission. There are going to be news stories, probably some very unflattering coverage about my departure from the military. I need you to know that things aren't always what they appear to be. The silence stretched across the phone line like a chasm opening between us again. Sarah, why? Everything was finally working out. Your career, our relationship, the family's pride in your service. Why would you throw it all away now? Because sometimes serving your country means accepting that the people you love will hate you for it. Because sometimes the most important missions are the ones that can never be acknowledged or celebrated. I don't understand. I know, and I'm sorry, but you're going to have to trust that I'm still the same person you've learned to respect, even when my actions suggest otherwise. The resignation ceremony was deliberately small and humiliating. I stood in General Hawkins's office, stripped of my rank insignia and ribbons, as a Pentagon photographer documented my departure from military service. The official statement cited irreconcilable differences with Air Force leadership and expressed disappointment in my decision to pursue financial opportunities in the private sector. The news coverage was worse than I had anticipated. Military blogs questioned my loyalty and suggested that my family's wealth had finally corrupted my sense of duty. Aviation forums debated whether I had been a genuine patriot or simply someone playing a role until better opportunities presented themselves. The comments sections were brutal, filled with veterans who felt personally betrayed by my apparent abandonment of military values. The hardest part was watching my family's reaction unfold in real time. Carmen called, her voice thick with tears, asking if the news reports were accurate. My mother sent a single text message that cut deeper than any enemy fire I had ever faced. After everything we've been through, how could you do this to us again? Uncle Derek's response was the most devastating. He sent back all the military aviation books he had purchased, along with a note that simply read, "I was wrong to think you had changed." My father didn't call at all. Within 2 weeks, I had moved out of my Pentagon-adjacent apartment and into a shabby, extended-stay hotel near Reagan National Airport. My new identity required me to look the part of a disgraced former officer struggling to find her place in the civilian world. I traded my crisp uniforms for worn jeans and faded t-shirts, let my hair grow out of military regulation standards, and practiced carrying myself with the slightly defeated posture of someone whose dreams had crumbled. The transformation was more than physical. I had to become someone willing to sell her aviation expertise to the highest bidder, someone who had grown cynical about concepts like honor and duty. During the day, I practiced my cover story in mirrors and voice recorders. During the night, I lay awake in my dingy hotel room, wondering if I would remember who I really was when this mission finally ended. The first contact came exactly 3 weeks after my resignation. A man with a vague European accent called my burner phone, claiming to represent aviation contractors working in emerging markets. He suggested we meet for coffee to discuss potential opportunities for someone with my background and current circumstances. As I walked into that coffee shop in Arlington, wearing civilian clothes that felt like a costume, and carrying credentials that portrayed me as everything I had sworn never to become, I realized that my real test wasn't the mission ahead. It was whether I could survive becoming the person my family had always feared I might be, even if it was only an act. The war for my country was about to begin, and this time, I would be fighting it completely alone. The coffee shop meeting led to 3 months of careful cultivation. Viktor Kozlov, the man with the European accent, presented himself as a broker for wealthy clients seeking discreet aviation services. His operation was sophisticated, with legitimate business fronts and carefully documented transactions that would pass surface-level scrutiny. But beneath the veneer of legal cargo transport lay a network moving weapons, stolen technology, and worse across international borders. My role was perfect cover. Sarah Martinez, bitter former Air Force major, struggling to pay rent on a hotel room while her wealthy family shunned her in disgrace. Victor saw exactly what I wanted him to see. A talented pilot whose principles had a price tag, and whose skills were available to anyone willing to meet it. The first test flight was a milk run from Miami to Colombia, officially carrying agricultural equipment, but actually transporting encrypted communication devices to cartel contacts. I flew a modified Cessna Citation through a route that avoided radar detection, landing on an unmarked airstrip carved out of jungle. The payload was small, but the implications were massive. This was the entry-level audition for pilots being considered for larger operations. Victor was pleased with my performance, particularly my willingness to ask no questions about cargo manifests that didn't match actual shipments. Over the following weeks, the assignments grew more significant. I flew industrial machinery to Syria that was actually dual-use technology for chemical weapons production. I transported supposed medical supplies to Somalia that were clearly military-grade equipment based on their weight and handling requirements. Each mission took me deeper into the organization's trust, while documenting evidence that would eventually bring down the entire network. The isolation was crushing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Military training had prepared me for physical hardship, for operating under extreme stress, for making life-or-death decisions under pressure. But nothing had prepared me for the psychological warfare of watching my family's pride in my service transform back into shame and disappointment. The news coverage of my apparent fall from grace was relentless, with military commentators speculating about the corruption that had led to my disgrace. Carmen stopped answering my calls entirely. My mother's weekly check-ins dwindled to terse text messages asking if I needed money, as if financial support could somehow compensate for her renewed embarrassment at having me as a daughter. Uncle Derek, who had spent months trying to understand military aviation, now made pointed comments at family gatherings about the unreliability of people who abandon their principles for profit. The cruelest cut came through a mutual friend who reported my father's response when asked about my situation at a charity gala. "Sarah made her choices," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "We can't save people from themselves." The words reached me through an encrypted message from my CIA handler, who thought I should know how completely my cover story had convinced even those closest to me. 8 months into the operation, Victor offered me the assignment I had been waiting for, A high-priority cargo flight from Belgrade to Tehran, carrying what he described as precision manufacturing equipment, but which intelligence suggested was actually components for advanced missile guidance systems. The payload was worth millions of dollars and represented a direct threat to American military personnel serving in the region. This was the mission that would require my full aviation expertise. The route passed through 3 countries with sophisticated air defense systems, requiring precise timing, altitude management, and navigation skills that few civilian pilots possessed. The aircraft was a modified Boeing 737 freighter, with hidden compartments and communications equipment that could defeat most tracking systems. I spent 2 weeks in Eastern Europe preparing for the flight, studying weather patterns, air traffic control procedures, and the personal habits of radar operators who would be monitoring my route. The level of planning required was equivalent to a military strike mission, except this time I was the one carrying the weapons instead of defending against them. The night before departure, I sat in my hotel room in Belgrade, looking out at the city lights while reviewing final navigation charts. My secure satellite phone showed 17 missed calls from Carmen and 4 voicemails from my mother. I couldn't return any of them without compromising the mission, but I listened to Carmen's messages, hearing the desperation in her voice as she begged me to call her back to explain what had happened to the sister she thought she had finally understood. The flight itself was a masterpiece of precision aviation. I navigated through commercial air corridors while carrying weapons that could kill American soldiers, maintaining the performance of a skilled but morally compromised pilot, while secretly documenting every detail for the intelligence agencies that would eventually prosecute everyone involved. The cargo manifest listed industrial drilling equipment, but the weight distribution and handling requirements confirmed it was missile technology. Landing in Tehran felt like crossing into enemy territory, which in many ways it was. The receiving team was professional and efficient, unloading the cargo with the kind of expertise that suggested this wasn't their first weapons shipment. I maintained my role perfectly, accepting payment in untraceable cryptocurrency while internally cataloging faces, voices, and operational procedures that would help intelligence services track the weapons to their final destinations. The return flight to Belgrade should have been routine, but routine was a luxury that didn't exist in my current world. 2 hours into the journey, my secure communications system activated with an emergency message from my CIA handler. Intelligence services had intercepted communications suggesting my cover might be compromised. Victor's organization had become suspicious of my lack of curiosity about their operations and my reluctance to recruit additional pilots from my military contacts. I was ordered to abort the mission immediately and exfiltrate to a safe location where agency personnel could extract me from the operation. But aborting meant abandoning 18 months of intelligence gathering just as we were approaching the network's leadership level. It meant letting weapons shipments continue flowing to terrorist organizations, while bureaucrats debated whether the risk to one undercover officer was worth the potential intelligence gains. I made a decision that would have been familiar to anyone who had served with me in uniform. I continued the mission. Over the next 6 months, I walked an increasingly dangerous tightrope between maintaining my cover and gathering the evidence needed to destroy Victor's entire operation. The stress was enormous, requiring me to be simultaneously the disgraced pilot Sarah Martinez and the intelligence asset documenting enough evidence to justify years of investigation. Every conversation was potentially my last. Every flight could end with discovery and execution. Every day brought new risks that my handler couldn't protect me from. The breakthrough came during a leadership meeting in Montenegro, where Victor introduced me to his superior, a former Russian military officer named Dmitry Volkov, who controlled weapons trafficking across 3 continents. Volkov was expanding operations into chemical weapons precursors and needed pilots capable of handling hazardous materials transport. The position required demonstrating complete moral flexibility and absolute loyalty to profit over principle. My audition was a flight carrying sarin gas components from Syria to Yemen, where they would be assembled into weapons for use against civilian populations. The mission was scheduled for December 15th, almost exactly 2 years after I had walked out of that Pentagon ceremony stripping away my military rank and identity. But December 15th never came for Dmitry Volkov's operation. On December 12th, Coordinated raids across 7 countries dismantled the entire weapons trafficking network simultaneously. Victor was arrested in his Belgrade office while reviewing flight schedules. Volkov was taken into custody at his Montenegro compound, surrounded by evidence of chemical weapons trafficking that would ensure he never saw freedom again. Dozens of pilots, ground crew, and financial facilitators were arrested in operations that stretched from Eastern Europe to South America. The evidence I had gathered over 22 months of undercover work formed the foundation for prosecutions that would prevent thousands of weapons from reaching terrorist organizations. The intelligence services estimated that my mission had prevented at least 3 major terrorist attacks and disrupted weapons supplies that could have been used against American military personnel for years to come. 3 days after the raids, I sat in a debriefing room at Langley, wearing civilian clothes that no longer felt like a costume. General Hawkins was there, along with CIA officials and representatives from half a dozen intelligence agencies. They reviewed my performance with the kind of clinical precision that characterized post-mission analysis, documenting lessons learned, and operational improvements for future undercover assignments. Major Martinez, General Hawkins said, when the formal debriefing concluded. Your sacrifice and service during this operation saved American lives and disrupted international weapons trafficking in ways that will have lasting impact. Your country owes you a debt that can never be adequately repaid. She stood and extended her hand, but instead of shaking it, she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a new set of Lieutenant Colonel's oak leaves and a citation that would never be made public, recognizing service that officially never happened in places that didn't exist on any map. Your promotion was approved 18 months ago, she said. We just couldn't tell you while you were undercover. The rank felt heavier than I expected, not because of the medal, but because of everything it represented. I had earned these oak leaves by sacrificing relationships, enduring isolation, and maintaining my integrity, while pretending to abandon everything I believed in. The promotion was validation, but it couldn't restore the family connections that had been severed by my apparent betrayal. That evening, I drove through Washington in a rental car, past monuments that looked different now than they had 2 years earlier. The Lincoln Memorial still spoke of government by the people, but I understood more deeply now what that required. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial still honored those who had given everything for their country, but I finally comprehended that sacrifice took many forms. Some gave their lives in combat. Others gave their reputations, their families, and their identities in shadow wars that would never be acknowledged. My official reinstatement was scheduled for the following week, with a cover story about classified assignments that had required temporary separation from military service. The news coverage would be minimal, focusing on bureaucratic reassignment rather than dramatic revelation. There would be no Colonel Patterson arriving to validate my service, no moment of public vindication that restored my family's faith in my choices. This time, I would have to rebuild those relationships without the benefit of external validation. I would have to convince my family that I was still the person they had learned to respect, even though I couldn't tell them about the missions that had required me to appear to become everything they despised. The conversation with my father would be the hardest, followed closely by explanations to Carmen and my mother that would necessarily be incomplete and unsatisfying. But as I sat in my car outside the Jefferson Memorial, watching tourists take photographs beside quotes about freedom and sacrifice, I realized that I no longer needed their validation to know my own worth. The 8 years of family exile had taught me to find strength in isolation. The 22 months of undercover work had confirmed that lesson while adding new dimensions to my understanding of service and sacrifice. I pulled out my personal phone and scrolled through the contacts I hadn't been able to call for nearly 2 years. Carmen's number was still there, along with my parents' home line and Uncle Derek's mobile phone. My finger hovered over Carmen's contact, considering what words could possibly bridge the gap that my apparent disgrace had created between us. Instead, I put the phone away and started the car. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life and rebuilding relationships that had been casualties of my service to something larger than family loyalty. Tonight, I just wanted to drive through the city I had served in secret, past buildings where decisions were made that shaped the world, through neighborhoods where people slept safely because of missions they would never know had been flown. The war was over, at least this one. I had survived with my integrity intact, and my mission accomplished. Everything else, the family relationships and personal connections that had been damaged along the way, those were battles for another day. But I had learned something important during those 22 months of isolation and deception. I was strong enough to fight those battles and win them, even if victory looked different than I had once imagined. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez drove through Washington in the early morning darkness, heading toward a future that was finally, completely her own to write. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.